The opinions and viewpoints expressed in .NET Rocks are not necessarily those of its sponsors, or of Microsoft Corporation, its partners, or employees. .NET Rocks is a production of Franklin's Net, which is solely responsible for its content. Franklin's Net, training developers to work smarter. Hey, Rockheads! Put down the ice axe, stop polishing your crampons, and listen up. It's time for another stellar episode of .NET Rocks, the internet audio talk show for .NET developers with Carl Franklin and Rory Blythe. This is Jeff Macielik, here to announce show number 99 with guest Stephen Forte, recorded live Friday, February 4th, 2005. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net, training developers to work smarter, and now offering hands-on VBNet, ASP.NET, and C# classes. Online at www.franklins.net. And by Data Dynamics, makers of ActiveReports.net. Simple, powerful, and cost-effective reporting for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.datadynamics.com. Support is also provided by Code Magazine, the leading independent magazine for .NET developers, online at www.code-magazine.com. And now, the man who wouldn't be caught dead in an LL Bean unless they were serving sausage, Carl Franklin.
Thank you. I want to introduce Rory in Portland, Rory Blythe, my co-host, as always. Rory, how are you doing tonight?
Fine, thanks.
Great. And this is the first post A&E Caesars 24/7 show that we've actually done, right?
Fine.
So
yes, thanks.
yeah. So that was us. Yes, you did see us on A&E Caesars 24/7. Sorry, we can't put up a clip unless we go to prison, but there it is. If you were watching, I think Rory, you have a schedule of times that it's going to be re-airing, right? On your blog?
I think it was going to... What is today? February what?
February 4th today.
Okay, yeah, I think it aired yesterday, and I think it's airing tomorrow as well, so on the 5th as well. So if you missed it, and if you're listening to the show recorded on Monday, then you actually missed it 2 more times in addition to the original. So
I'm looking at your blog, and by the way, your blog, man, I hadn't been there in a while, so I went over to see what you had posted about us being on TV and all.
I visit your blog every day, but go
I know,
ahead.
And I saw this. I read this story. This is an essay that you and Adika wrote, your girlfriend, and called "Star Trek: The Experience at the Hilton in Las Vegas, Nevada." And I was actually in bed reading this to my wife on a tablet PC on my tablet.
Is that
PC.
how you get her in the mood?
Yeah, that's how exactly. But and we were just laughing hysterically, man. This is
That's awesome.
Just really funny stuff.
That's actually just the first post in a whole series, and the best stuff is yet to come. So,
and Shrinkster URL is shrinkster.com/3NG. So if you go to shrinkster.com 3NG, that'll bring you to Rory's blog post about Star Trek: The Experience, which, man, I was just rolling on the floor. It was just hilarious, man. You could take some of your best posts and publish a book, and it'd be right up there with, Mark Twain and Madonna.
I don't know about that. But I had actually, or I have been considering doing exactly that. I went through and I culled about maybe 30, 40 of what I thought were probably the best posts that would be worthy of publication. And I'm trying to figure out what to do with them right now. And I'm either thinking about releasing them as a book somehow, somewhere, or about beginning to submit them to magazines. But one of my goals that I announced on my blog this year was to get published in 2 places this year that have nothing to do with tech.
So if you have any publisher contacts outside of the developer world, listeners out there, give the man a break. He needs it. The world. And
I
needs
don't
to hear
mind,
him.
doing favors to win, better things. If you know what I mean by favors, there's quotes around it, and it means a whole lot of stuff. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. But.
So the thing about A&E is that we were in Vegas at Dev Connections, and I know we got to start the show soon. Hang on, Steven. But anyway, we were in Vegas at Dev Connections. We went to Caesar's Palace. It was Nick Landry, Active Nick Landry is what he calls himself, and Rory and myself and Jeff. And Mark Miller was there, and Pat Hines was also lurking in the shadows. And Nick tried to pick up this woman in the bar there at Caesar's, and they filmed the whole thing. And, he basically got smacked down. Yeah, she basically, and he, to her credit, he was kind of a dork, The funniest part was when Rory stepped in. He sensed that it was going poorly for Nick, and Rory just couldn't take it anymore. So he stepped in and tried to get her to do something or say something or at least acknowledge that, whatever. And that was pretty much the most hilarious part of the whole video, I thought. And I was just there providing, I don't know what I was doing, just, commentary. I wasn't really all that funny, man. You were the star of that show.
Well, I was just trying to get laid, but then she called me gay, and that made it kind of difficult. So
you were not.
Okay, I wasn't.
You just want to throw a pie in her face.
I did, kind of, actually. Still. So, yeah.
All right, well, before we get started, we had a couple of pieces of mail just real quick. This one's for you, Rory. This one's from Ralph Loizo. He says, Rory, I believe that you would have great success in writing text adventure games. I still reminisce about the old Infocom games. I've always wondered, though, how it would be to incorporate speech recognition into those sort of games. Instead of retyping common commands like go north, get lamp, or kill the green dwarf with an audio recording of Jay Franklin's Java show, you can just say them just in case you're planning on making a web or Windows version in addition to your CE versions. Just an idea. Keep rocking. .NET Rocks, Ralph Luizo. And that was kind of cool. That was a reference to, we were talking about those Infocom games on a show previous.
Yeah, and I've gotten a few emails about the whole game idea. And a lot of people are mentioning the Infocom games, and I actually wrote one using Inform, which is this language and compiler that is really bizarre. And it's designed to compile your source down to the bytecode that's recognizable by a Z engine, which is the virtual machine that was invented to run Infocom games. So I have written an Infocom style game, and I've kind of been there. And that's not what I'm going to be working on for the phone. The phone is going to be a rather different kind of thing, and I'm in the process now of charting out all the logic. And it's a very, very different process than putting together a desktop application. There are a lot of different things to consider, and you have this whole world where you have to keep track of a lot of elements, and you have little things affecting other little things. It's complicated, but it's also kind of gratifying.
Was the game actually Rory style or funny kind of game?
Oh yeah.
Oh really?
It was Rory style.
Do you have a copy of it? You could let us have.
I do actually have a copy of it. It's unfinished. I had the whole outline written, and I wrote about the first 25% of it.
Wow.
And I doubt most people would even get that far. But it was fun. I sat down one night back before I was working, when I was just out of college, and I just went through and...
Oh, that ought to be awesome.
Yeah, got this sucker out.
We'll put up a link to it or something.
There's a chihuahua in a clown suit. I mean, it's pretty typical Rory. There's a hot air balloon. I mean, there's a lot of crap. So
that's great. We'll put up a link. This is the second one here from Ian Dixon. Dear Carl and Rory, I'm a massive fan of .NET Rocks. It's so good to listen to informative and entertaining shows like this. There's nothing else around like your show. I wondered if you could get on or talk about two massive managed applications from Microsoft that you haven't talked about before, Microsoft CRM and Windows Media Center. I'm in the process of rolling out CRM, and I think it's a fantastic showcase for .NET technology. The web app is all ASP.NET, and it highlights how .NET can be used on enterprise systems. The other .NET program, Windows Media Center, is also an excellent product. The UI is one of the slickest apps I've ever seen. It's changed how we watch TV, and even my wife can use it. It has a good SDK too, and I have been able to develop an RSS reader and some other apps that sit inside the Media Center application. Wow, that's pretty cool. My next project is a .NET Rocks listened from the MCE. I don't know, I think he might have wanted to say listener from the MCE interface. I hope Media Center catches on and more people develop add-ins for it. Keep up the good work. Ian Dixon, Manchester, UK. Ian, to tell you the truth, I don't know about you, Rory, but I didn't even know Windows Media Center had an SDK or there was any XML or anything like that. So
yeah, I just found out during a conversation with Chris Sells. I had no idea before either. So that was news to me.
Wow. Well, that's cool. All right. Well, we'll have to ask around Microsoft and see if we can get some people to come in and talk about that. Both of those things sound great. Thanks, Ian. Well, my guest tonight is Stephen Forte. He's the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Corzin Incorporated, a Manhattan-based provider of online market research data for Wall Street firms. Stephen is also the Microsoft Regional Director for the New York Metro region. He speaks regularly at industry conferences like TechEd, North America Developers Conference, and other conferences around the world. He has written several books on database development and currently is writing the Microsoft Press book SQL Server 2005 Core Developers Guide. Prior to Corzin, Stephen served as the CTO of Zagat Survey in New York City and was also co-founder and CTO of the New York-based software consulting firm, the Aurora Development Group. He currently is the co-moderator and founder of the New York City .NET Developer Users Group. Why don't you welcome Stephen Forte for the second time on .NET Rocks. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Carl. It's great to be back.
And for those of the listeners who don't know you and what you're all about, you're the reason we had those references to mountain climbing in the intro there.
Yes, it is.
Seems to be a passion of yours, and you actually did some really incredible things mountain climbing. I mean, some people climb mountains, but you what are some of the mountains you've climbed again?
Some of the mountains I've climbed in the last year have been Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, the tallest mountain in Africa, and Mount Rainier out near Seattle. It's the second tallest mountain in the continental United States, and probably the toughest you can do. It's a really tough climb. It was actually harder than Mount Kilimanjaro. Did a couple in Alaska last summer right after TechEd, and been out to Everest Base Camp and lots of mountains in the Northeast, Mount Washington and Mount Marcy, and lots of other mountains that may never heard of in Switzerland and other places, but they've been a lot of fun.
And you did mention Mount Everest, right?
Yes, I didn't, of course, go to the top of Mount Everest, but I was on an expedition that was going to the top. One of our expedition members is even attempting to ski down from the summit. And
oh, my God.
The first woman to do it, yeah. It was a pretty wild experience because I was on an expedition for 3 or 4 weeks, and it really gave me the ability to see what a true expedition that would go to the summit was like. It was led by Wally Berg, who has summited 7 or 8 times, and all the Sherpas were there in 96 with the disaster, so I had firsthand accounts of, the 96 disaster and also the IMAX. A lot of the Sherpas worked on that IMAX film, so it was a really amazing.
What was the 96 disaster?
It was what the book Into Thin Air was written about.
Okay.
It was the disaster where I think about 8 or 9 people died on the mountain. Scott Fisher, and then
wow.
All those. It was pretty big news about 10 years ago.
I just wanted to say, Stephen, so you're a pretty successful guy. From the whole intro and everything, you're like CTO of this and CTO of that, and you're like a regional director and entrepreneur and mountain climber and stuff. And it just smells and reeks of success. So I was just wondering if I could have some money.
You can have money? Sure.
Okay, I just when I meet people like you.
Envelope. And,
yeah. Did everybody get that? Okay, well, cool. I just wanted to make sure.
Like Bhutanese money or Nepalese money, or because you didn't specify what kind of money you wanted.
Look, I'll take what I can get.
I just got back from Egypt. You can have some Egyptian pounds that are left over in my wallet.
Oh man.
So you guys want to talk about some computer stuff?
Yeah, I think we probably should. The last time you were on, you were talking about the Zagat survey online, which you sort of rescued from a failing project, and I know we talked about that at length offline too. They were suffering from some severe scalability, if I recall.
The scalability.
And you fired the Java people, and not I shouldn't say that because now people.
Yeah, the problem wasn't with Java. The problem was just poorly written application. If you would have written in .NET, it would have been a horrible application the way they architected it.
Right. I didn't mean to imply that. Sorry, Java people. But yeah, you basically kicked out the team that was working on it and re-implemented it all in .NET and saved the day. And so this stuff that you're currently working on is SQL 2005. But before we get to that, because I'm really interested in that, We were talking at, I believe it was the PDC. No, it was TechEd. And you had done a session on interoperability where you actually had some different disparate systems up on stage and some experts on those platforms and hooked them together with some web services and did some stuff. Am I recalling this conversation correctly? I thought it was really cool.
You are. The solution that we provided, it was actually Richard Campbell and I did a duet session at TechEd. I guess that was last year in 2004 in San Diego. We had Oracle 10G running under Fedora, and we had a SQL Server 2000 running under Windows 2003 Server. And what we did is we had a .NET client that I wrote, which is a simple ASP.NET application. And the .NET client talked to the SQL Server 2000 machine. The SQL Server 2000 machine then used Enterprise Link Services to connect to the Oracle running on the Linux box. So then what we did is we wrapped all the P-SQL calls inside of a T-SQL stored procedure. And then all those calls basically ran the queries, executed everything that we needed to do, inserted, edited, updated, deleted. And at one point, we decided to migrate the data in the session. We migrate the data over and to the SQL Server, and all we did was change our stored procedures to no longer talk to the Oracle database and talk to the local SQL Server database. So our ASP.NET application didn't have to change a single line of code, not even a connection string.
Wow.
So what we were demonstrating is when you do a big migration project, you migrate the data last. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
That is cool. That's very cool. Yeah, I thought that makes for a good story, especially, people struggle with interoperability out there all the time, and it's good to hear some success stories. The
tools are there. I think actually, if I remember correctly, 2 years ago when I was on the show, we were talking about some COM interop, and we were talking about how folks were a little hesitant to use COM interop because there might be a few extra cycles here or there, and all the tools are there. And the performance is there. There's some little quirks. When we did the Oracle, a day or two of my life that I need to get back was about case sensitivity in Oracle. We just didn't think our connection was working, but it actually was just that we were typing in queries and we were typing in case insensitive queries. So SQL Server, we're not used to that, even though as a C# developer we are. But with SQL Server, we were like, this select uppercase, lowercase, and Oracle is more strict that way.
And this another point of interest that we have been talking about a little bit on Mondays, actually, believe it or not, was this developer.net auction for services to aid the tsunami victims. Tell us about that.
Sure. What happens is, obviously, we all know about the tsunami. Well, Julie Lerman has up in Vermont. She's been doing a lot of consulting work for free for an indigenous Indonesian charity that was set up after the Bali bombings. They're based up in Bali, and they're doing all this great aid work over in the province that was hit real hard. And she decided to try to get some folks together and rally up support somehow. And it came up the idea that an auction would go on. And what happened was we got 30. Basically, almost all regional directors. We've got about 25 regional directors, and with 30 of us in total, put up an auction, a multiple-item auction on eBay, and it ran for 10 days, and 100% of the proceeds would go for the tsunami relief we would give to this particular charity based in Indonesia. And the way it would work is that someone would bid for 1 hour of this consultant's time, either through phone or IM or email, presumably to do something like a code review or something like that. And the response was pretty overwhelming. We got, obviously more bids than there were, contractors available. And what we also did is eBay rules, I might not want to say this on the radio, but eBay rules say that a multiple item auction, you pay the same amount as the lowest winning bid. We kind of changed the rules and said, well, you pay whatever you want, as long as it's the minimum. And whoever pays the most money will get the choice of the first contractor.
Okay.
Doing kind of like a little NFL-style draft. And somebody gave $3,000 for 1 hour. So we're poised to make well over $10,000.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, it really is great. It's all community-based. No Microsoft really was involved. Julie came up with the idea. She approached me to kind of organize it and rally the RDs around it. And we worked together. It was the day of the blizzard a couple weeks ago and just built the eBay auction, lots of emails and phone calls to the other people involved. And The auction, I think, just completed on Wednesday at 9 a.m., and it's great. So
that's awesome, man.
Pretty excited about that.
Tell us a little bit about your background, and I know the people who want to hear about Yukon and SQL 2005 are just chomping at the bit, but tell us a little bit about your background, your programming background and the kind of stuff that you've done. Brag a little bit.
Sure thing. Bragging's something I can do pretty easily. One of my favorite topics, right, I guess we're going on to, is me. So I started programming seriously a little over 10 years ago on Wall Street. I was working at Fidelity Investments and moved over to IT, doing mostly risk management type stuff in like VB4, and took a little C++ and all that fun stuff, and eventually figured out that consulting was this is during the mid-'90s stock market boom that led into the late '90s, early 2000 dot-com boom, and decided maybe I want to start my own business because, there's just easy money to be made. And I didn't know much about business, but back then it was easy. And luckily for me is I learned kind of along the way because the market was very forgiving. And one thing led to another. I had some IP that I wound up selling to actually Microsoft Home Advisor, some wireless real estate stuff. And decided that I wanted to get out of the consulting business, that writing applications and selling it many times over was the way to make money. And one thing led to another. I was looking for some venture capital, and I was actually firing clients, and one of my clients was a GAT Survey, the restaurant people. And at this point, I was doing really high-end client server work. This is probably the late 90s, end-tier development, large websites. And Zagat was looking for a chief technology officer, and that's where the story from the previous show came out. I was there for a couple of years building, large-scale web applications. But interestingly enough, we built probably some really huge content management, very custom survey management and content management stuff internally. Then the .NET alphas and betas came out, and we were an early adopter. Mark Anders came to our shop and kind of sold us on .NET, and so we were one of the first Windows Forms applications ever to be deployed. We deployed it before Beta 2, so we actually deployed it on Beta 2 bits. And we got the demo in front of Bill Gates' team, and we were actually on the short list to be unveiled at Comdex as one of the .NET folks, and Continental Airlines beat us out. I guess they were a little more well-known than Zagat. After Zagat, I left there after a while and started a company with a business partner called Corzin, which kind of mines the web, both public places like government statistical data, private places like Dun & Bradstreet, stuff we buy, and then like the job boards, and we measure the hiring patterns of every company in the United States. And what we basically do is take that data and kind of superimpose it over the government data. We're able to link them together with the Dun & Bradstreet data that we purchase, and we can kind of come up as a leading indicator for the job market. So we know when Alan Greenspan said there was a soft patch, we saw that soft patch in our data. So we sell this to economists, we sell it to Wall Street firms, equity analysts, and then oddly enough, since we're scraping the job boards, we sell it back to the job boards that we scraped from. So the technology we use there is a lot of regular expressions, as you can probably imagine. I kind of dream about regular expressions. It's kind of scary. And we scrape about 3 million data elements a week, so you can imagine the size of my data warehouse. We've been doing this for about 3 years, so my data warehouse is bigger and bigger each week, by an order of magnitude. And so I spend a lot of time writing SQL code and managing regular expressions. And, of course, our whole entire application is a ASP.NET application. So that's kind of where I spend my time.
So, Stephen, this is something I've been really curious about, and I've never really talked to anybody who's gone through and done exactly what you're doing. But when it comes to regular expressions and scraping other sites for data, are there any legal issues at all that you encountered where you're using this data and then you're selling it, and in some cases even selling it back?
That's an excellent question, because I get that question all the time from the business folks, especially like investors and business partners that are not interested in the technology of what we do, but
other people's lawyers.
Exactly, and we spend probably a good $10,000 with a law firm that would remain nameless, and going through those issues back when we were poor, and the founders, myself and the other guy named Bruce, were not making any money. We spent a good solid $10,000 in the bootstrap phase on this particular issue because an investor did not want to touch us with a 10-foot pole. And And what we learned was that we are there's like that thin line, and we're on the correct side of the thin line, but we're pretty much in our legal rights to do so, because what we're doing is we're taking the data and we're aggregating it. We're not really we're not going out and saying, okay, I'm going to take this job off of Monster.com, post it on my website as it's my job, and then maybe have a link back to Monster or something. No, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, for the category of nurses in New York City, there are 482 job openings this week from these companies. Compared to last week, there were 287 job openings. And of course, we do the statistical analysis to say, there's the increases, the decreases. So we're not really selling to the consumer or anyone the actual jobs themselves. We're just selling the aggregate data.
So you just consume the data and then you
Exactly. And then what we do is we kind of crunch it on top of the government data with the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. That's all free data. And then we kind of have our own proprietary algorithms and data transformations on top of the Dun & Bradstreet data that we merge it with. So we went through that process, and people were frightened, and we were very surprised because, some of our first customers were the Wall Street firms, but then I believe it was Career Builder was the first of the big job boards that came knocking on the door. And we're like, wait, we almost didn't want to pick up the phone. We're like, we want to talk to Career Builder. And my business partner, Bruce, who's the CEO, he's met with the CEOs of actually all three of the big boards and some of the smaller ones like Dice.com. And, Dice.com is a customer of ours as well. So they can't really stop us if you think about it. I can tell you the solution that I came up with to have them have me fly under the radar. But they can't really stop us from a legal standpoint, because what if I hired 10,000 interns that needed some money? And they basically had a big Excel spreadsheet and manually went to every URL. It's public data. So they really can't stop us that way. But I've written and architected some pretty unique ways to kind of prevent my IP address from ever coming up on their clickstream reports.
Oh, wow. Because I was going to think that possibly your traffic might increase overall stats and make it a little easier to get advertising dough anyway, although maybe your usage is so small that it's not even a drop in the pond for them.
Well, if you think about it, if you think of Career Builder, we just hit every week, we hit every page they have, right? Just once. So we spider the entire site, but we're not really, going crazy. We triggered at Yahoo for Hot Jobs. We triggered their automatic denial of service attack software because we were going a little too faster than a human being would do it. So all we did was put a little delay in, and
that's awesome.
That stopped it. But what happens is we're now moving into automotive, and we have a couple customers. We just started our second vertical. We've been spidering some automotive sites, and they've not been as receptive as the other folks have. Now, we know we're within our legal rights. We've spoken to these sites, but they have some automated software that kind of just turns off our IP addresses. So we're like, what do we do? So there's a bunch of free proxy servers out there. And you can basically have a free proxy server to kind of, protect against identity theft and being anonymous on the internet.
This is kind of sleazy, man, isn't it? I mean...
Yeah, the proxy server?
No, just the whole, you're consuming data without their consent,
Hey, but he's making money. There's nothing sleazy about that.
Well, I'm not consuming data without their consent because I'm within the bounds of their terms of use. So it's actually, we're just tripping off their denial of service software. It's not really that they're trying to shut us down. If they were trying to shut us down, they would send us angry cease and assist letters and that type of stuff. Yeah. They know full well we're doing it. Okay. They just won't give us any help when it comes to their turning off their anti-denial of service software.
I had a very similar experience, and I don't mind publicly humiliating them because I'm really mad. But I joined the Connecticut Technology Council, and I'm not humiliating. I'm just telling a story. I joined the Connecticut Technology Council, which is a group of people here in the state of Connecticut, the great state of Connecticut, that belong to technology companies, and they get together and they hobnob and they have lectures and dinners and functions and stuff, and it's wonderful. And so I joined. This was before I started teaching Franklin's Net. I had a company called World Train. I was writing some software for remote training. So I went up there and basically found that I was, really couldn't pierce the armor. It was very difficult to meet people, very difficult to to figure out what people were doing. I mean, you basically went to a function. You had about 5 minutes in between talks to do any kind of networking whatsoever. There really wasn't facilitating networking at all. But they had a website, and every member of the Technology Council had a little thing on the website with information about their company and their email address and their contact info. And it was really buried, though. And my stuff was up there, too. But, I didn't get the sense that the other members were, going and using that as a networking thing. So I emailed the guy, and I said, hey, I'd really like to introduce myself to the members. Can I send a message to all the other members and let them know that I just joined and, where I am and what I do and, see if there's any potential for collaboration or whatever. And I got back a nasty email saying that basically, no, there'll be a breach of privacy, blah-de-blah-de-blah, we can't do that. And yet all their email addresses were on the website. And, I asked a couple times and he basically told me to pound sand. And so I wrote a little application, screen scraped the website, got all the email addresses and names and stuff, and wrote out a letter. And I got a lot of very positive letters back. And this, of course, was way before spam was a big problem.
Right.
And people weren't that sensitive. They didn't get that much email. You didn't get 100 emails a day. So I got did a lot of great networking, and it worked out well. And then I canceled my subscription, my membership. Because that was kind of useless, and I got a call from them the next year, and it was, hey, Carl, would you like to sign up again? And I told him the story, and he basically said, well, you're obviously one of these whiz kid technology guys who, most of our members wouldn't do that, and you've obviously found a way to, And I said, well, aren't you the Connecticut Technology Council? Isn't this something that you should be able to facilitate doing? It just boggles my mind, that there are institutions out there that have, every intention of facilitating whatever it is that they're doing, and yet they don't have the very simple technology or even rules set up to allow it to happen.
So, Steve, you wanted to talk about Clickstream.
Mm-hmm. So basically is a big problem that we would have for these anti-denial service software that kind of would kick in is we might hit the site and we go to a web page that says, page 1 of 17, displaying 500 jobs. Well, we have to walk down that site all 17 pages. So we have a lot of regular expressions that go get the hrefs, then we do other HTTP posts. So if there's 10 items on a page and we're going to 17 pages, we have to go make 170 hits to the website pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So what we basically are going to do is we would use this on our regular machine. Now our IP address could be kind of blocked because the anti-denial service software thinks that we're sending over all these packets. So what we did is we found some free proxy servers out on the internet, and we keep around a list of them in a database table. And every single request that we do comes from using a different proxy, using the .NET web classes. So we have a different proxy for each page. So on 170 hits in a matter of 1 minute, if we have 50 or 60 proxies in our database, the same IP address will only be on that clickstream 2 or 3 times. But yet we know how to re-architect that call together. So it's virtually impossible now for anyone to really know where our traffic is coming from.
Oh, that's awesome.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. And what's cool is some of the proxy servers eventually kind of go away. They're no longer available. So because we spider 24/7, so our application keeps track of that and actually will stop and then go scrape the site that has the free proxy service, put them into the database list, refresh, and then keep using new proxies.
So essentially what you've done is you've converted your application from a denial of service attack to a distributed denial of service attack.
Yeah, just don't tell anybody. We're completely benign.
So from the geeky kind of point of view, Stephen, whenever you guys are adding a new company whose website you're going to scrape to your application, how do you have it set up? Do you have like a set of interfaces, or do you have like a set of abstract classes that you implement, and then you just drop a DLL in a directory and it gets picked up and becomes part of the whole application?
Question.
How are you guys doing that?
Well, the way it really works is we're database driven, so we add the regex patterns to a table. And we have a big kind of URL table that says, these are all the URLs to scrape, and we just constantly are looping through that table. So we add the records to the URL table, and if the particular, and then there's a couple codes, so the application knows that, I handle you this way, and I know how to handle you that way. So what will happen is we'll go down kind of the queue, and if an application needs something specific, we have a factory class, and we just kind of pull it out and then say, okay, for this particular site, use this little block of code. So the application itself, sometimes when we add a site, will run unmodified. We just add the patterns and the URLs and the identification values into the database.
Wow.
Cool.
That's pretty slick, man.
Yeah, because scraping and search, search is the big thing right now, right? The way, the internet was a few years ago and the way whatever. And you hear MSN search and Google and this and that. And so all these little companies are forming to do scraping so people can start doing local search and things like that. And they've all approached us, and none of them are database-driven. They all kind of like go out there and scrape pages and kind of recreate the internet. And, we're database-driven. So we've not been able to use any of these vendors because we've did a complete homegrown application, but it shows the power of integrating with the database.
Yeah. Folks, do yourself a favor and check out our friends' Data Dynamics website, datadynamics.com, makers of ActiveReports.net. Simple, powerful, and cost-effective reporting for Windows Forms and ASP.NET. Very nice stuff. You compile the reports right into your application, ship them with your assemblies. Has all the great features you come to expect in a reporting engine. And you can use ActiveX controls right in the reports, too. So, great stuff. Data Dynamics has been an excellent sponsor of .NET Rocks for a long time. They deserve a little bit of your love and attention. So go check them out at www.datadynamics.com. So what have you been doing in Yukon? And before you answer that, let me just ask, as sort of an aside, I get the sense that you're a busy guy with a lot of, high-level things on your plate. How much actually rolling up your sleeves and writing code do you do these days? Like, how much attention are you paying to, syntax, or are you mostly zoomed out at the architecture level?
Well, what's interesting is Corzine is a pretty small company. We have 5 permanent employees. 3 of them are technical. So as a CTO, I run the entire tech division, which is 3 people, myself included. And then we have 2 contractors in India. And, we have 2 different firms in India, one that does some development where I manage 2.5 developers there. And then we have a data entry firm in India. And they do a lot of data entry with a lot of our research products. We have a lot of government research products. So I spend a lot of time, as you can tell, managing, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I'd say that's probably a solid 25% of my time. And I spend probably 50% of my time architecting. I'm the lead architect, and I probably spend the other 25% coding. So I do actually write a fair amount of code because we are small. And I still lead the code review of my 2 developers locally and remotely in India. And I also speak at a lot of software conferences, so I have to write all my material. And, it's all material that I write. I don't use other folks' material. So I'm actually pretty much in there. I'm a little surprised. At the GAT, it was a little different. It's a bigger company. There was about 150 people, and the tech division was about 35 to 40 people.
Right.
I probably spent about 50% of my time managing, and only maybe 10 or 20% of my time architecting, maybe 10 or 20% of my time coding, and maybe 5% of my time, in meetings and just wasting time, or 5 or 10% of my time wasting.
So I take it you've had opportunity to dive into the the syntax of the sort of the low level stuff in SQL 2005?
Oh, down to the point where I've really investigated two specific areas where you're just specifically mentioning syntax, where syntax is kind of interesting, is T-SQL. I've really kind of gotten down as I'm not bullish on the CLR stored procedures, and I can explain why as we progress.
Okay.
So I've really thrown myself behind the new features of T-SQL, the common table expressions and the ranking and windowing functions.
Whoa. Common table expressions and ranking and windowing functions.
Have you heard of them?
No. Well, yeah, but let's talk about those.
Okay.
Just briefly.
A common table expression in SQL Server 2000 is a non-persistent view. So it gives you the ability to declare a block of code, which will be a select statement, and then use that block of code. So I can say, without kind of having a coding in front of me for the audience to hear, I can kind of speak through it. Is you can say with and give it an alias name, and then you have like select star from this table or however you want to do it. And that's kind of enclosed in parentheses. And then what you do is you have another SQL statement that refers to your previous statement.
Okay.
And then you can join it, you can aggregate it, you can do whatever you want in it.
Wow.
And the neat thing about it is that it goes out of scope. It goes out of memory the minute your query goes out of scope.
It's stack-based. That's cool.
Yeah, and the neat thing about this is it gives you the ability then, of course, to do recursive queries real easily.
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's the reason they mean, the team, it's the reason why the T-SQL team over in Yukon has built common table expressions in the first place. So there are so many times today as when I'm using SQL 2000, and Mondays I tend to write a lot of SQL code because our weekly process finishes Sunday night, so we're always kind of writing ad hoc queries or fixing something or doing something. And I'm telling you, at least 2 times a day, I'm like, I wish I had the common table expressions in SQL 2000 already. Especially if you do anything with a temp table or a cursor or a self-join, you already know you could be using a common table expression.
Yeah, that's sweet. And the windowing functions.
The windowing functions are really cool because they're really they're ranking and windowing functions. So one of the things that basically you can do is there's 4 different types of ranking functions. The first one is row number, which will give you a row number over an expression that you define. So you can say, select star from customers, rank over customer ID. And if you have 100 customers in your table, it'll give you give you a row number. And that's pretty neat if you want to kind of sort by the row numbers and do things like that. Interestingly enough, is these ranking functions, you can't reference to them in a where clause. So how would you think you can reference them in a where clause? You create a common table expression and filter by the column. So you can actually kind of combine these features together. So rank will give you rankings the way the Olympics will give you a ranking, gold, silver, bronze, and if 2 people get a gold, there's no silver, there's just a bronze. And then there's something called a dense rank, which will do the same thing, but it'll fill in the gaps. So it'll give you a gold, a silver, 2 golds, a silver, and a bronze. And then there's the percentile or the entile, which will evenly distribute all of your data across a value you give it. So if I say, percentile over this column 100, it'll break it down into 100%. If you have 100 records, it'll give you 1 through 100. If you have 1,000 records, you have 10 at 1.
That's really
10
slick.
at 2, 10 at 3. They're really cool, and they only exist, just like a common table expression, they only exist in the scope of your query. So they're not permanent, and that's what's neat about them. I've been doing a lot of writing with these common table expressions and with these ranking and windowing functions, and you would have to do these obnoxious, like outer joins, self joins, and it's crazy.
I've always
they
been
really
one of
save you a lot of time.
That's what I was going to say, man. That joins are one of the things that I like least about programming in T-SQL, or developing stored procs in T-SQL, and that's really going to save quite a bit of effort, wasted brain power, I call it.
Yeah, especially in tables that have what I call a domestic key. Domestic key is what I call a self-referencing column, where you have the classic reports to instead of a foreign key. I call it a domestic key. Name's kind of stuck in all the shops I've ever worked in, and some database architects like to use that. And then you do these weird self joins, and now you can just do a union all common table expression and kind of recursively walk down the stack. It's really cool.
Slick. So anyway, you were on your way to make another point.
You asked me about syntax. You were trying to geek out a little bit. And the other thing that has really kind of weirdo syntax, I was telling somebody the other day, is once you've mastered regular expressions, you have no fear. So the other thing that I decided to tackle, and
Mark Dunn thinks those look like a cartoon character swearing.
Oh, yes. It looks like more like a cartoon character swearing in Japanese. So what happens is I decided to take upon the xQuery engine inside of SQL Server 2005. And it's really neat because there's an XML data type built into SQL Server 2000. So now we have an intrinsic type. The cool thing is now you can query individual columns, and you can say, I want to see this particular piece of XML where an element inside of that column is equal to this expression.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff. So
it makes parsing easy.
Excuse me?
I was just going to say it makes parsing really easy.
Oh, it makes parsing really easy. And, back in the Zagat days, if you remember, we were talking about that, is we believe in highly relational databases, for OLTP. And internally at Zagat, we had these really big relational databases, 12th normal form, And I believe I made a couple Dr. Cod references on the last show and got a bunch of emails like, who's Dr. Cod?
Yeah, right.
Who since has passed away, I think, since that episode, actually. And Dr. Cod, the inventor of the relational model. And so we had what we've basically discovered, as everyone discovers really early on, reporting off of relational data sucks.
Yep.
I'd rather be kind of, at high altitude without my crampons on than code super highly relational database for, big, large reports.
Some overzealous Codites had gotten into the database where I worked in this startup firm in California. And, just to have like something that you would normally express in 2 or 3 tables and be, pretty darn relational. These guys wanted to split into like 12 or 13. I can remember doctors and patients, but since they both have names, we made a names table.
Oh, boy.
Oh, yeah. And, it was just like...
Let's normalize first name. Let's normalize first name.
Where do you stop? I mean,
where do you
stop already. Why doesn't this thing work? Well, maybe it's because you have 17 joins here. You're just trying to return a simple query. It was horrible.
Well, this first normal form and second normal form, and this, I think most people go up to like third. Some people go up to fifth normal form. There's also I think there's 17 normal forms. And I think once you go past about 6 or 7, you really have to have like a PhD, and no one really does it in the real world.
It's just so impractical.
Right. So as you discovered and I discovered and everyone's discovered if you work with databases, you transform the data to a nice flat reporting table.
Yeah.
Which works great on the web. However, at Zagat, we had some unique kind of requirements, is that we had to transform our data to a variety of different platforms. We had to transform the data. We did a browser sniff if you were on the WAP phones, the mobile phones, and this is 5 years ago, so it wasn't even anything, anything else. So what happens is we basically did these XSLT transformations on the server or sometimes on the client, depending if it was an IE browser. But we had no way to query what was inside of that XML field. So as we transformed that XML field out, so we stored XML in the database on our website, but we had to store all the search columns inside of the table. So we had primary key, search column 1, search column 2, search column 3, and then like the XML field. So now with xQuery, and it's pretty darn fast, with xQuery you can just throw an xQuery right against that XML column and, take out whatever you need. Yeah, there's a couple things you need to do to get xQuery to work. You need a primary key on your table, a regular primary key, and then you need an XML schema bound to your XML column, because you don't want, you don't have to, but you don't want xQuery to think everything's just text, right? You want to have an XML schema to define the actual XML you're searching against. And then you create an XML index. SQL Server 2000 gives you the ability to create indices on XML columns.
Right.
And you create what's called a primary index, which all it really does is links your XML column to the primary key of the table. And then you can create one of 3 types of indices over that index. The first would be for fields, the other would be for path, and the other one would be for properties. Properties you're only concerned about if you're trying to query out schema. Path would kind of speed up your XPath expressions if you have a really huge XML doc document with lots of attributes and elements. And then the data for value is where you would actually, it actually would index the actual, things that are in between the tags. So you want to probably always put a really good, you probably would always want to put in a value index and an index for the actual XPath itself. So I've done some speed tests on this, and it performs lightning fast.
I was going to say,
really good stuff.
When you said pretty darn fast, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, I've put in tables about 31,000 records and a pretty large XML column itself, meaning I put in, like an invoice type of a thing that might have, hundreds of records on it for some of the examples.
Okay.
And I wanted to query out maybe just, where this particular attribute, this tiny little attribute, and it comes back in sub-second response time. It comes back just as fast as I'm writing a relational query.
Wow.
And the beauty of it is if you have other relational columns inside of your table, you can actually combine XQuery and regular SQL expressions in one T-SQL statement.
Jeez.
You can say select star from table where customer state equals New York and XQuery your XQuery expression equals this, and then it will give you back all the matches.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Does this require GUIDs for primary keys?
No, you can have any kind of primary key that you want as long as it's not the XML column itself. The XML column cannot be a foreign or a primary key.
Speaking of GUIDs...
You can actually create a unique index over your XML data.
Right, because you could have duplicate... speaking of GUIDs, though, what's your take on that in general? I know you probably don't have a hard and fast rule, but are you a big fan of using GUIDs as primary keys?
I only would use them in a scenario where I'm doing something in a replicated environment where I'm pushing data out and folks in the field can enter data that would be in the same table. I'm a fan of meaningless primary keys, identity seeds, and a GUID is a perfectly acceptable form of it, slightly more overhead because it's a little bigger. But I have no real opinion either way, shape, or form.
All right.
My preference is for just a regular integer with an identity column on it.
I guess the pro GUID camp would say, they're more difficult to get wrong because, if you just get off by one or something like that, you can be in, number hell, integer hell, so to speak, right?
But I'm not sure why they make that argument because the theory behind an identity column is that it is meaningless. Meaning it's just we call that a surrogate key.
Right.
In database theory, it's just completely meaningless.
Right.
So if I have gaps in my primary key, I could care less. I can always run a DBCC. I forget the exact command off the top of my head, and resequence my primary key. Meaning is if I've deleted some data and I want to start from the highest number, I can reorder my seed, but if you're making your primary key mean something, meaning is my primary key represents something in the real world, then by all means use a real piece of data. If you're trying to force your auto number to be something, you're doing something wrong.
That's an interesting thing you say that. Our .NET Rocks site, our old one actually, and the new one as well, when you select a show, from the archives, it passes a primary key, show ID, which is just a number in the database, a primary key. And the shows have numbers, show numbers, right? Show number 1, show number 100 is coming up next week. This is 99. And the numbers don't necessarily jive with the primary keys. Now, we started out in sync, and then we got one off. And people were seeing that show ID equals up on the URL and saying, hey, man, your numbers are off. And it's like, no, it's just a primary key. Will you shut up and leave me alone? But, it did cause a lot of confusion about, our numbering being off.
Right, exactly. Well, if you were using SQL Server 2005, you can use the row number ranking function that would give you an automatic sequential number.
That's
and
cool.
then use that as your query string.
Yeah.
But I'm also very opinionated about using query strings in particular. I try to avoid them like the plague.
Yeah.
Because of that exact reason.
Yeah,
and then
you don't want to have to show that. Yeah.
There's not much you can do in that such circumstance.
Yeah, well, the other thing that we would do is probably just make it query by show number instead of show ID, and that would lessen people's confusion.
Don't you think people who email you with those type of questions just are paying a little too much attention to the URL? And
sometimes I wonder, when I get emails like this, if I'm not paying enough attention. It's like,
well, I think if you think of just database integrity and database theory, it's that number is meaningless. So
right.
I can see why people were confused because they would think the show number would equal the show ID.
Sure, yeah.
If you used a GUID now, or GUID,
then they would be
there's always been a debate. That's my New York accent, right? Ken Getz told me it's GUID.
It's actually GUID.
Yeah, well, on the West Coast, they say GUID, I think.
Exactly. Ken being from the West Coast, who's recently moved to the East Coast, so maybe he'll start saying GUID. I'm not sure.
I doubt it. Now all those people down in Florida are going to start saying GUID is what's going to happen.
Yeah, and then it's going to kind of proliferate.
Yeah, it's going to spread north. We're screwed. We're losing our identity, man.
Yeah, exactly. So the GUIDs. And if you use the GUID, I guess it would be, or you could do another thing is you can use the random seed, and then you can have show ID 4678412.
I don't know. I'd feel a little bit strange about using randomness unless the number was really, really, really big and there was no chance that they would duplicate. Or does it not duplicate?
No, it will never duplicate unless you've deleted. Automatically, if you use the SQL Server identity column in any version of SQL Server going back to at least 4.3, and before that I don't really have any experience with it, if you use the seed and it's going to be random, it will never duplicate a value. Now, in theory, you could have deleted a value, and then that value can be back later on at some other point in life. Right. But good database developers never delete anything, right? We just flag it as inactive.
So you say you're sort of anti-CLR, VB, C# stored procedures, and do you see any possible use for them?
Oh, absolutely do. I don't want to really go on record saying I'm completely anti them. They're pretty cool and they have a use. However, I don't think they're going to be this new thing that's going to propel us off into the future the way that all the other things that have been hyped for Microsoft in the past were like web services and everything else. I think what happens is there's a really good use for CLR stored procedures in one case, and that's the cases where you're in SQL Server 2000 and you're a developer and you're sitting in front of Query Analyzer and you go, I really think I now need to make an extended stored procedure. And I'm going to go out into VB or C++, and I'm going to write myself a DLL, and I'm going to compile it and register it, and then I'm going to kind of just, instantiate that DLL from inside of my SQL Server stored procedure with an extended stored procedure. And so wherever you're going to use an extended stored procedure in SQL Server 2000, you should be using the CLR stored procedures in Yukon at SQL Server 2005. If you're migrating your database over, it'd probably be really cool to rewrite all of your extended stored procedures in .NET and use extended stored, using the CLR stored procedures. Because T-SQL is the most efficient way you're going to retrieve and edit and update and delete data.
Right.
CLR stuff is going to be the most efficient way to, let's say, do something like a regular expression pattern inside of your database or write out to the file system. So
what about
you're never going to
too?
use the CLR for data access. You're going to use it for other stuff, which, as I said, would be like an extended stored procedure.
Yeah, that's essentially what my thoughts are too. Anytime you would have an extended stored procedure, that's your. I guess there's been a lot of warning flags in earlier shows that as soon as we knew this was possible, we were putting up the warning flag saying, you don't think that you're going to be writing all of your stored procs in VB and C# now. And, although I did talk to a couple of DBAs who were previously developers, developers turned DBAs, and they're really happy about that because now they're using tools that they're familiar with. But I think there's also a lot of DBAs out there who are not developers and maybe are, starting to take some training classes or learn a little bit about development because they know that they're going to have to brush up against it. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that what I think about that is that it's a very different paradigm writing code in T-SQL than in VB or C#. VB and C# are, they come from the history of very procedural language. We do things like looping and stuff like that. T-SQL is set-based, right? Yep. So, SQL basically returns data in a data set, well, not data set in the .NET word, right, but a data set environment. And you have to think of it in that respect. And that's why a lot of developers who are turned T-SQL developers or developers turned to DBAs, they tend to write a lot of cursors and consume a lot of resources because that's what we're as developers very familiar with. So I would recommend all DBAs and database developers to really kind of go out and take a good, nice class on T-SQL and, figure it out. And when you're sitting in front of, Enterprise Manager or the Query Analyzer, basically say something like, now I'm thinking like a data person. I'm not thinking like a VB or C# programmer. And then vice versa when you're in VB. When you're in VB and C#, you're consuming data, you're looping through it, you're sending requests back. When you're in T-SQL, you're thinking of data, coming back as a nice set-based language.
So I wanted to ask a question just about the general layout of things. Like when you install SQL Server 2005, is it installing its own .NET runtime? I mean, how is this working? Where's everything coming from?
That's exactly what happens. Is SQL Server 2005 actually hosts a version of the CLR. It will be the same version of the CLR that ships in Whidbey, .NET 2.0, but it actually does host it internally. Internally, I think they call it SQL OS or something like that. Don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure what it's called. And by default, it's turned off. So if you want to use the .NET features, you actually have to turn it on, which is a T-SQL command that you can use to turn on the the CLR.
Let me ask you to clarify that. And you're saying that even if you don't have the standard .NET Framework runtime installed, don't worry about it because this isn't going to install it and use it. It's going to have something within its own directory structure. Or is it going to require the standard framework runtime? It's
going to require the standard framework, but it hosts it in its own address in
just
memory.
Like ASP.NET does.
Exactly.
Or IIS, rather, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It works exactly like that. So if you compile so you can't use, let's say, something that's in the global assembly cache, right? Because SQL Server won't understand it, and it doesn't, it's not talking to that, instance of the CLR. It has its own instance of the CLR. So you need the regular framework. SQL installed by default, obviously, is still in beta, so we're not sure how the fundamentals of the install will run. But from all the betas, you basically install the framework, then you install the actual database engine, and you register the assemblies that you're going to write your CLR stored procedures. You register those assemblies inside of SQL Server. There's actually T-SQL commands that you use to register the assemblies. So it's all done within SQL Server itself.
Almost seems like SQL Server is being this little operating system in and of itself.
In some degrees, yeah. That's exactly what it's like. At least for hosting the CLR.
Yeah. Interesting. And in terms of, processes and memory usage, what's going on there with, one per database, one per server? What's memory?
I believe it's one per database server, not one per database itself.
Per instance?
I could be wrong on that.
Per instance, is that what you're saying?
I believe it's one. Yeah, right. One for each instance of Yukon you have going.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. And it's a much better and tighter and cleaner implementation than extended stored procedures, which were almost a hack to some degree. That was just forced in there because there was a need, and Microsoft gave us a way to fill that need. But with the CLR stored procedures, it's as we can see with all the hosting and everything else, it's much tighter and neater. It's just as you said with those red flags. I don't want to see developers going and writing tons of data access code in VB.NET or C#.
Yeah, the typical scenario is, hey, we can now move all our business logic into the database.
Oh, goodness.
You don't want to do that. Please don't do that. Don't even think about doing that.
It'll give all the consultants out there lots of work to do to go clean up.
Dr. Cod, come whip your ass.
Exactly. Here's one of my reasons why I think Microsoft gets a bad rap is because since they give us all this power,
right?
You can do it a million different ways. So lots of folks, the entry point to developing at Microsoft technology is very easy. Meaning, is you can go in and kind of start using this stuff and eventually get better. And the entry point for the Oracle guys is much harder. It's there's less tools and there's a lot more syntax and it's a lot harder. So they usually get the comp sci type guys and the true kind of geeky guys like that. And quite frankly, their developers usually will architect something a lot more stricter. And in the Microsoft world is you have a lot of guys just throwing some things together every now and again. And what will happen is Microsoft will get blamed for maybe a couple poor designs here or there.
Yeah.
Because
that's why
I've seen that 1,000 times.
In the training business, we're always hearing, we want best practices. We want best practices because you literally have, just like you said, bazillions of ways to do everything. So people want to know the best way. I guess that's what the PAG group is all about.
Exactly.
Well,
really great stuff coming from that group.
Oh yeah, and they're doing stuff with SQL 2005 too, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
They
I've been going through their threats and countermeasures for ASP.NET security book recently. That's been what's my hot topic. Just I'm getting a little paranoid. We had somebody write a fraudulent check from our corporate checking account for $16,000 the other day, and I've just started saying, we need to pay a little more attention to security, even though that has nothing. Someone writing a false check on our account has nothing to do with web security, but it just kind of like, So I went out and bought the book, and I've really been going through it.
Tell us, for the uninitiated, what our experience of Yukon is going to be like in Visual Studio, at least as far as you know.
Well, the neat thing about it is you fire up, Visual Studio 2005, and just like today where you get, you choose your language, VB, C#, choose your language, let's say you click on C#, and you get the database, you get the project types. And what I think is pretty cool is you have a project type that says, Windows, Forms, ASP, Web Service, and there's one that says Database. So you click on the Database project, and the first thing it does is it asks you for a connection, and you provide a connection. And then you can just type in a regular, VB or C# method, like your traditional hello world, that takes input parameters and returns output parameters. And you compile it. Then you go over to, just like a regular standard type of, Visual Studio class that you would create. And then you go over to, SQL Server, and you can start using that method. You have to register it with SQL Server, which is just pretty much a line of code. And then, boom, you can basically call that as it's a user-defined function, or if it's a stored procedure, however you decided to declare it. And the neat thing about it is you can use .NET types or SQL types. And we know that nulls are handled differently in SQL Server than they are in .NET. So, you can make decisions on what type of types you want to use, which can get you into trouble, but also gives you a little bit more flexibility. So,
what are the best practices around mapping null values between ADO.NET, say, and SQL 2005?
My best practice that I've come up with yet, and the product isn't released yet, so obviously take it with a grain of salt, but I've been playing with the product for 2 years now. My best practice is to always use the SQL data types. So you would have the same functionality that you would have in SQL Server, unless you need to do something specific. So
and then you cast
I would say, excuse me?
And then you just cast to whatever you need, right?
Exactly, right. You just cast it to whatever you need to do. That would be the best practice that I would recommend for all the developers out there.
That makes sense. Actually.
Yeah, I've only done that. We have a couple of we have Yukon running on a couple boxes at the office, and all of our DTS transformations are now using the new they call it now SQL Server Integration Services, and we've luckily have gotten to be friendly with the team because we found a couple bugs because we've moved a lot of stuff over, and in a development mode and logged in even a couple showstoppers, and they've been pretty grateful for us finding those bugs early on.
Hey, do you mind if I just shift quickly out of 2005 and more to a more IT question, which is something that I'm really interested in and have not had the opportunity to do, and that is clustering, like SQL Server clustering. Have you done that? I've
not done SQL Server clustering. No, I have not. It's,
okay.
I've done partitioning tables over multiple disks. Partitioning a database over multiple disks. So I have multiple file groups. But SQL Server clustering itself is actually clustering the same SQL Server database over multiple particular machines.
Yeah.
What I've done, and this is what we did at Zagat and a couple other places, is done a warm backup with a transaction log shipping. So then, we do a backup maybe every hour, and then we do the transaction log shipping at every checkpoint or something like that.
Transaction log shipping, what's that?
Basically, is you ship your transaction log over to another machine, which is in theory an identical machine. So you do a checkpoint and you do a backup. Then you take that backup and apply that backup to another machine. So figure you have machine A, which is your live wire, machine that's up on the internet that powers, Zagat.com or franklinnet.com or whatever. And every hour, let's just say, we use that for the sake of argument, you have lots of traffic. Every hour you take a backup. And presumably your website's going to have a lot of static stuff that doesn't need to be backed up, right? That's transformed from your production data back in your back office. So you really want to back up like your credit card transactions and that type of stuff. So presumably you're not backing up even a tremendous amount of data, but you want to back it all up because your Amazon.com, let's say. You don't have to back up all your book data, but you have to back up all of your transactional data. which I put into 2 separate databases on the website, and even have different user accounts. So if somebody tries to do some type of funky SQL injection on my query strings, they're going to be using a read-only SQL Server account, unless they're doing something on my online shop, which is a different database itself using SSL and everything else. Probably has no query strings. So what will happen is you take your actual backup, apply it to the other machine, and then what happens is after that backup, what you do is you have your transaction log, and you ship the log over to the other machine in case within that hour the other machine goes down. And then what you do is you flip the switch over to use the other machine and apply the transaction log over.
Okay.
You're pretty much up to date. So
that's pretty cool. So, what's your opinion on using RAID for SQL Server databases? RAID 5, RAID 0+1? What's the best?
Before I answer that question, let me just get back to with the clustering. Is one of the reasons why I never done clustering was because I've always found that if you architect your application, I don't believe you can kind of be scalable by, adding lots of hardware. I don't think, if you look at the definition of scalability, adding more units of work and lowering the cost of unit per work, I choose to always say you can't scale a website with hardware. And that's what a clustering solution is. So if you architect your ASP.NET application and your stored procedures in your database to be rock solid, every website I've ever worked on, and I've even seen behind the scenes like big sites like SuperBowl.com, and I've been inside of the NASDAQ stock exchange's back office in my former life as a contractor. I haven't architected those particular systems, but I've been part of the team. And what I've always noticed is that the database application, the database server, is never really that impressed with these applications, even if you have like 12 million concurrent users. IIS and ASP might choke, but the SQL servers never seem to go above 20. Zagat.com never went above 20% CPU utilization.
What kind of hardware was it running on?
This was a number of years ago, so this is about 5 years ago.
Jeez,
but it was basically,
Pentium
what was it again? Something like the server must have had about 1 gig or 2 of RAM and four processors, stuff like that. It wasn't, it was a very powerful, probably about $20,000 machine, but it wasn't really anything, spectacular in that respect.
Yeah. All right. So on to RAID.
Well, I've always found that there's obviously you want RAID 1. Basically, RAID 0 is not recommended really SQL Server at all, right?
Striping.
Without any kind of other available plan. I like to use RAID 1 and RAID 5. I'm a big fan of putting separating my indexes into a separate file. SQL Server allows you to have files for your SQL Server allows you to have files for your your MDF and your LDF, but you can break up your MDF, and you can have one file for your indices, one file for your transaction log, and one file for your database tables. And you can even further break out your database tables. And I've always been a big fan of having 3 separate files, one for the transaction log, putting it on a different disk, one for your indices, putting that sometimes on a different disk, then one for your data tables. And I found that RAID 1 is great for transaction logs, right? It provides the mirroring for redundancy. Right, it's optimal for sequential writes. There's no striping going on, right? So a transaction log. Think of how a transaction works. Transaction log works. Sequential writes, right? So it's really good. So what I like to do RAID 5, it gives you parity, but it also gives you striping, right? And that's really good for fault tolerance without the expense of the duplicate drives used for the mirroring. So you're basically placing some data on all the disks. And, it's great for read operations, right, because it uses fewer disks than RAID 1, right? But it's not optimal for a transaction log, which basically, does mostly sequential writes. So in essence is, RAID 1 is great for that transaction log, and RAID 5 is great for your indexes and your, your database.
And if your database isn't changing that often is what you're saying. You're not doing a lot of writes, but you're not continuously writing to it, but you are continuously reading.
Your transaction log is continuously writing, and sometimes writing in big chunks, so if you're updating a lot of data. So more than likely, your database is going to be reading more than writing. Even if it's a 60-40 scenario, you're better off using RAID 5. I definitely have come across that.
That's cool, man. I never even thought of doing that, separating them out like that.
Right, because think about how it all works. Everyone always knows, let's put the transaction log on another disk for fault tolerance. But I'm like, well, why would you bother putting your transaction log on a RAID 5 array?
That doesn't make any sense.
Expense and everything else and complexity. You basically want to put that on a RAID 1 because all it's doing is sequential read-write access, which is what RAID 1 strives for. The striping is what's really cool for RAID 5, but that's great for reading the access in a non-sequential fashion.
Have you ever had to serve up large files, like say 50 megabyte MP3 files, that may have audio talk show content on it or something like that? Have you ever had to serve up a lot of large data files on a website that ran into scaling problems?
I've never done that. I think my experiences with that is something like Napster or LimeWire, but I've never I've never had to deal with exactly what you're kind of mentioning. I've basically had to deal with large amounts of data in databases and maybe write out things to the disk, but they've always been like maybe 5 or 10 megs, that type of stuff. And we've been lucky as we can dynamically create it and then let people download it and then get rid of it.
Because interestingly, we had a problem. We got a new server to host all of the files, and we have a RAID 5 situation, which is really nice for this because we only update it once a week or so.
Right. And for reading.
Yeah, for reading. Exactly. And we have this issue, or we had this issue. We think it's done now. But basically, people were getting downloading, maybe half a show, 25% of a show, and then it would just cut off.
Really?
And it wouldn't actually say, tell them, that the transfer was abnormally aborted or something like that. It would. If I looked in the logs, it would say, 200.
Really?
Yeah. And I found out through, a process of working with Microsoft that there's a little setting you can set in the registry, and I think there's a command line switch for it, where you set the minimum bytes per second value of IIS. Really? And it's by default turned up a little bit. So if the bytes per second, if essentially a transfer is going too slow, it'll get cut off, to sort of prevent the leeching kind of denial of service attacks. And so we think, and so that's what we think was happening. So what I did was I turned that to 0, and but since then we've had a bandwidth crunch, and I'm not really sure if that's the cause of people's. Obviously now they're getting slow connections, but so as soon as our bandwidth little crunch here is over in a couple of days, we think we want to ask people to note if that happens, to let us know immediately. We think that solved the problem though. But there's just these kinds of issues just never end. They
really don't. And I remember I started life. My interest into technology kind of was building Excel macros and Lotus macros on Wall Street, 10 or 12 years ago, and then Access databases. And it was simple. We wrote a little Lotus script behind a 1, 2, 3 spreadsheet and sent it off to the business guy. And it was one file, and you had to worry about some syntax and maybe a file mapping. But other than that, you were golden. Now you have these, what version of the framework and where and why and how. There's always something. Yeah. It makes it interesting, though.
Yeah. And you're not a big fan of putting blobs in databases, are you?
I'm not a huge fan, but I'm not morally opposed to it either. I say if you have a reason to do it, go for it. I have in the past, for websites that store it, I find that a little superfluous. Just basically store the reference to it in your database, or have your application have a reference to it. But
doesn't it slow down all the queries basically, because now there's this big chunk in the disk there in every record we got to skip over?
Well, SQL Server is pretty good with the data pages. As for reading, you're absolutely correct. But we're talking microseconds. Depending on the speed of your disk. If you have really fast hard drives on a nice RAID 5 array, it will go right over that pretty quickly. And remember, it's not stored as part of the record. It's stored different than the data page itself. So if you're not retrieving that value, it's never performing the link to that blob object.
Right.
Only when you're actually including it in your select statements. That's why select star from table that has big blob in it is bad if you're not using the big blob object.
Yeah.
And select star from a table is always bad, especially with ADO.NET, because ADO.NET is going to go and try to retrieve and resolve the properties, do open schema, so to speak, when you're doing a select statement. So you always want to kind of limit the number of fields you're going to pull back.
Well, it's about time to wrap up. Rory, do you have any other questions you want to ask Stephen? I know I've been sort of dominating here.
No, it's fine. I mean, I was just thinking about everything you guys were saying. I was kind of off in La La Land and thinking about how I would solve these problems myself. And I figure, like, when it comes right down to it, when you're talking about RAID and you're talking about clustering and this and that, in my experience, if you just add more spot watches, then everything goes faster. So I like to have clusters of spot watches. That's how Neopolian.com is stored. Actually, redundant spot watch centers all across the U.S. that I like to keep secret.
Don't forget the hamster wheels.
I like the hamster wheels personally.
The only problem is sometimes the battery goes out in one of the watches. You lose a node and stuff like that, or you get the weather or something like that, and that kind of interrupts things a little bit. But it's a pretty reliable system. But that's all I was.
As long as you don't water cool your PCs.
Like Richard Campbell.
Yeah. Exactly.
I actually had thought of, if I ever build a house, putting in copper pipe in the wall just for water cooling PCs and watering plants. I think that would be a really cool idea. But anyway,
cool purpose.
Yeah, sure. And of course,
return on investment will be faster.
Fresh water wherever you're standing in the house. Just get to a wall and put a little.
Problem is, up in Connecticut, your pipes would freeze easier.
Yeah, that's true.
Because the best conductor is going to be copper.
You got to have PVC or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, anyway, Stephen, you got any events coming up you want to plug, or anything else you want to call it? Say hi, Mom, or anything else?
Well, I've got a couple events. As you know, I speak around the world a lot. I'll be speaking at in Algeria at the North Africa Developers Conference in April, and then in Istanbul, and then a conference in the Netherlands and TechEd. But before I do all of that, I'm going to be running a marathon, actually down in Antarctica.
All right, so for our listeners in Antarctica, make sure you go down to the marathon and watch Stephen run.
People have been joking that I could be the regional director for Antarctica. I can have a whole continent to myself.
You could be the president of Antarctica, for that matter.
There's a lot more smarter people in Antarctica than me. That's for sure. Lots of scientists down there,
And the guy who had to land there in that little RV-8 or whatever it was that he was flying that ran out of gas.
Oh no! I'm taking a boat, and then I take a dinghy onto shore and run the marathon, and kind of take the dinghy back to the boat.
You are kind of dingy for doing that in Antarctica. Actually, that's pretty crazy.
Well, my goal is to do something extreme and athletic on all 7 continents, and this will, of course, be the last one, the toughest one, and I'll probably never go back. So many people go to Antarctica in their later advanced age when they're retired and sit on a boat and look at penguins. I figured, well, I can kind of run up and run around and do a marathon, and it's a good story on .NET Rocks, and there's a lull in a party. I can kind of bring it up, I guess.
One other thing I want to bring back from the shows the way we used to do them is I used to ask the guests, what are some of their favorite tools or utilities or websites or things that they've downloaded recently that...
Hey, I don't mean to interrupt, Carl, but Chris Sells is calling. You want me to take it?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Chris. Hey, so I'm on .NET Rocks right now, and so are you. So what's going on?
Can't hear Chris.
Oh, okay. So Carl says that Chris says he appreciates me letting him know that he's also on .NET Rocks. Did you want to say hi to Stephen Forte? Are you still there, Chris? You know what, Chris? Maybe I should call you back. It'll be about 5 minutes. Is that okay, Chris? Okay, bye, sweetie. I love you. I'll call you then. Okay, bye.
Bye, sweetie. I love you.
Sorry about that. He just he never stops calling. He's always asking for coding advice. And,
well, anyway, I often ask my guests, if there are any tools or really cool things that you've downloaded recently that you want to talk about. Anything really spectacular out there?
Well, there's actually something. I won't call it spectacular, but it's really useful. And you may have even spoke about it before. But you're talking behind the scenes. You do some MSN chats, and I basically have friends that are in my Microsoft universe that are all on MSN chat. And, so I have an MSN account. And then I have, like my dad who's on AOL chat. And then my girlfriend, she's on Yahoo chat. So I used to have like all these chat clients pop up. So now I use a tool from a company called Trillion, just called Trillion. And it basically gives you one user interface for all the chats. And it's great because the chat window pops up. I don't know if you're on MSN or Yahoo. As long as I have an account on each one, I have a skin for it. And it's one client with, as many windows as I want. And it's really good. So it's, you can get it for shareware. There's probably a free version of it as well. And I think you paid $20 or $30 and it works just fine.
Doesn't have the bells and whistles though, right? Like video. Yeah.
Doesn't have the bells and whistles, and I've always thought that I think software gets bloated, besides maybe the most bloated, the award for the most bloated piece of software is obviously Microsoft Word.
Microsoft Word,
especially for features not used. And I don't know, Clemens Vasters made me go on to the latest MSN the other day, and he was able to kind of click some buttons, and my chat window started to shake. I'm like, wow, that's the most useless thing of all time. So I kind of actually think, I think chat is a very productive tool. I manage, chat with my contractors in India, and I have one developer in New York who works at home, not at the office, and we're in chat all day, and it's great. And other than that, though, I get bombarded with folks, who I guess are in either other time zones or something else, and they don't. They don't realize that I'm at work and maybe can't chat as often as they can. So I have all these windows open, and I find chat can be sometimes very low productivity. However, if you start shaking the window around and you can send like animated kisses and hugs and weird stuff, it's even less productive. So I think that using Trillion kind of justifies using chat.
You need to have tabbed chat support, in your chat client. You have to.
Exactly.
If you're talking to more than 3 people, it's just a necessity.
Oh, I hear you.
But I guess Microsoft just isn't into the whole tabs thing, like everybody else discovered 5 years ago. Anyway.
Oh, that's an interesting thing that I've recently downloaded. Would be I use the Firefox browser for that exact feature for the tabs.
Yeah. It's very cool.
I have one browser open and I have like 22 tabs. It's great.
Yeah.
Especially like just today, I was with my business partner, and we were comparing our staging server to our. We have a forward staging server, and then we have a QA server, and we're comparing data on both of them, and then we're comparing it to production. So we had the same kind of web page open because there's 3 different databases or 3 different web servers. So we had the same page open on all 3, and just flip through the tabs as opposed to going down and going back up. So pretty cool stuff.
Cool. All right, man. Well, it's been a great show, and on behalf of myself and Rory and Jeff in the sound room and all the listeners all around the world in every country that we touch, I want to thank you for coming on .NET Rocks.
Thank you.
Always fun to talk to you. We're still going to do that show in New York at Tony's Pizza, right?
Can't wait. Be great.
All right, guys. Take it easy.
Bye.
Take care. Good night.
Good night.
Life is hard.